Imagine, if you will, two very old and mighty neighbors. For thousands of years, they lived side by side, sharing ideas, art, and ways of life. Their cultures were like two branches of the same ancient tree, growing close together. But then, something terrible happened. Over about 100 years, these neighbors, who had once been so close, became bitter enemies. They fought terrible wars. What could have changed them so much? What turned friends into foes in such a brutal way? To understand this great change, we must first travel back in time to the heart of Asia. We go to a place that called itself the Middle Kingdom. This was China. For thousands of years, China saw itself as the very center of the world, the most important place on earth. It was a shining light of new ideas, beautiful art, and deep wisdom. The Qing dynasty, which was the ruling family at that time, was vast and powerful. They believed they were the best rulers, like a kind elder brother to all the countries around them. They had a special way of dealing with other countries called the tributary system. This meant that other countries would show respect to China, perhaps by sending gifts, and in return China would offer protection and allow them to trade. This idea that China was the greatest was a belief as strong and as old as the Great Wall itself. It was simply how things were. But even with all this greatness, a hidden problem was growing inside China. Like a very old, very tall tree that looks strong from the outside but is slowly rotting inside, the Qing dynasty was beginning to weaken. Its way of running the government, called the bureaucracy, was once very good and efficient. But over time it had become slow and stuck in old ways. It was also full of people who only cared about getting rich for themselves, not about helping the country. This was called corruption. New ideas were not welcome. People in charge held onto old traditions very tightly, stopping any fresh changes. The strong heartbeat of the empire was getting weaker and weaker, like a quiet whisper instead of a loud drum. The first big signs of this inner weakness didn't come from outside China. They came from within. The middle of the 1800s saw one of the most terrible and deadly wars in all of human history. It was called the Taiping Rebellion. It was like a huge storm that tore China apart. From the year 1850 to 1864, a man named Hong Xiuquan, who believed he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ, started a massive uprising of poor farmers and ordinary people. This was more than just a fight. It was like the end of the world for many people in China. Millions upon millions of people died. Some say as many as 20 to 30 million people, maybe even more. Whole parts of the country were completely destroyed. The government, the Qing dynasty, was completely lost and couldn't handle it. They had to ask local armies and even foreign help to stop the fighting. This wasn't just a sign of weakness. It was like China was bleeding badly, getting weaker and weaker. It left the empire very fragile, like a broken vase, easy to be hurt even more. And then the true danger arrived. From the West, powerful countries, with their amazing new machines and weapons, started to gather around China. At first, they didn't come with big armies. They came with something else, something much more sneaky and dangerous. Opium. Opium was a powerful drug that made people addicted. The Opium Wars, which were fought in the middle of the 1800s, were a terrible shame for China. Britain, a very strong country at the time, wanted to trade and make money. They flooded China with this drug, and it caused a huge problem. China tried to stop it, but they were not ready for modern warfare. Their old weapons and fighting styles were no match for the British ships and guns. China lost terribly. Because they lost, China was forced to sign very unfair agreements called unequal treaties. These treaties took away China's power. They had to open up their ports, which are cities by the sea, for foreign trade. They had to give away land like the island of Hong Kong to other countries. And foreigners were allowed to live in China under their own laws, not China's laws. This was called extraterritoriality. Special areas called foreign concessions popped up all over China. These were like little islands where foreign laws and rules were in charge. This wasn't just about money. It was a huge blow to China's pride and its belief that it was the greatest. It showed everyone that the Middle Kingdom was no longer the boss. It was like a giant chess piece moved around by stronger players. Anger and hatred for foreigners grew very strong among the Chinese people. China, the sleeping giant, was not just asleep. It was sick and hurting, a pale shadow of its past glory. It was ready to fall if someone pushed it hard enough. Now, let us look across the narrow sea to a group of islands called Japan. For hundreds of years, Japan had chosen to be alone. It was like its own small, private world. The country was ruled by a military government called the Tokugawa shogunate. Japan was very proud of its unique culture, its brave samurai warriors, and its calm way of life, away from the troubles of other countries. But this peaceful isolation, this being alone, was about to be completely broken. It wasn't broken by problems from inside Japan, but by a sudden, strong shock from the outside world. The year was 1853, and the shock arrived in the form of 4 mighty warships. They were powered by steam, blowing out thick smoke, and they sailed right into Edo Bay. These were called the Black Ships of Commodore Matthew C. Perry. He was sent by the United States of America with a very clear and forceful message. Japan must open its doors to trade. For over 200 years, Japan had rigorously controlled its foreign interactions, only allowing a very small amount of trade with the Dutch. But when they saw the incredible power of Perry's ships, the shogunate, the rulers of Japan, had no choice. They had to agree. The doors of Japan were thrown open, and the world rushed in. This wasn't just about opening up. It was a wake-up call, a very harsh lesson about how powerful Western countries had become. What happened next was truly amazing. The black ships were like a spark that lit a huge fire, leading to a radical, super-fast change called the Meiji Restoration. This started in the year 1868. It was a revolution not of the common people, but of the smart and powerful leaders. They had a fierce, almost desperate desire to make sure Japan would not suffer the same humiliating fate as China. The old system, where samurai warriors ruled Japan for centuries, was quickly taken apart. Power was restored to the young Emperor Meiji, but really it was a group of very smart and forward-thinking leaders who took charge. They understood how serious the situation was. Economically, Japan embarked on a dizzying race to build new industries. Modern factories popped up everywhere, making things like cloth, steel, and machines. Trains were built across the land, connecting different parts of the country, making it easier to trade and communicate. Telegraph wires hummed with messages, bringing Japan into the modern age of information. This wasn't a slow change. It was a fast, forced burst of speed. Japan quickly changed from a country that mostly farmed to a country with many powerful industries in just a few decades. In terms of its military, the changes were even bigger and more impressive, and also a little bit scary. The samurai warriors, who had been the main fighters for Japan, were no longer needed. Instead, Japan built a new, modern army. All young men had to serve in the army. They were trained very carefully, learning from the best Western armies. They studied the German army, which was known for being very organized and precise. At the same time, Japan started building a huge navy. They built powerful warships just like the famous British Royal Navy, who were the masters of the seas. This wasn't just about defending Japan. It was about showing its power, about letting the world know that Japan was strong and important now. In society, things also changed a lot. Everyone, rich or poor, had the chance to go to school. This meant more people could read and write, and they were eager to learn and help their country. Because all young men had to join the army, it made people feel like they were all part of one big team, one nation. The main idea behind all these fast changes was a simple but very powerful motto: Fukoku Kyohei. This means rich country, strong army. It was a clear statement of what Japan wanted to do. It was a desperate promise to itself that it would never be weak or humiliated like China. Japan wasn't just waking up. It was rising very, very quickly. It was a nation full of big plans, driven by a powerful mix of fear of what happened to China and pride in its own strength. And now we come to the place where all this tension would explode. A small piece of land called Korea. It was like a tiny spark waiting for a fire. Korea was located in a very important spot, right between these two powerful countries, China, which was falling, and Japan, which was rising fast. Because of its location, Korea was sure to become a battlefield. For China, Korea had always been a vassal state. This meant Korea was a country that showed respect to China and was under China's protection, like a younger brother. It was a very important area, acting like a shield, protecting China's northern borders. It was a key part of China's old system of dealing with other countries. To lose Korea would be a huge loss of face for China, a great shame, and it would mean losing a very old and important part of its history. But for Japan, Korea was much, much more. It was seen as a dagger pointed at the heart of Japan. This meant that if a country unfriendly to Japan controlled Korea, it would be a huge danger. More than that, Korea was a vital stepping stone, a bridge to the big lands of Asia. It was a place where Japan could get resources and start to expand its own power. As Japan grew stronger and more modern, it started to interfere more and more in Korea's economy and its government. At first, it was subtle, then it became very clear and strong. Inside the Korean government itself, a dangerous fight was growing. There were two main groups. One group was very old-fashioned and wanted to stay loyal to China. They saw China as the rightful leader and the source of all good culture. But another group, who wanted to bring new ideas to Korea, was very impressed by how fast Japan had become modern. They started to look to Japan for help and ideas, thinking that Japan could help Korea become modern and free from China's slow and old ways. These arguments about who to be loyal to became more common, more heated, and even violent. It was tearing Korea apart from the inside. The air was thick with tension. It was like a very dry forest, just waiting for a spark. Throughout the late 1800s, small problems, diplomatic arguments, and tiny battles happened again and again. These incidents were like small drops of water slowly filling a bucket. Korean officials were sometimes killed. Japanese buildings in Korea were attacked. Chinese soldiers were sometimes sent to Korea to stop problems. Each little incident, even if it seemed small by itself, added more suspicion and more anger to the already troubled situation. Both China and Japan were testing each other, looking for weaknesses, moving closer and closer to a direct clash. The stage was now completely set. China, the ancient empire, was weak and shamed, trying desperately to hold onto the last pieces of its power. Japan, the new and ambitious country, full of modern strength, was determined to make its own future, even if it meant fighting against the biggest and oldest powers. And Korea, caught terribly in the middle, was like a small toy in a deadly game. The air was heavy with unspoken threats, the sounds of coming war growing louder and louder. The small problems before were just the beginning. The fuse had been lit. The question was no longer if a war would happen, but when. And when it did, the world would see a terrible clash that would completely change the map of Asia, forever altering the path of history for millions of people. You're immersed in The Dragon's Fury, a documentary that brings history's most pivotal conflicts to life. If you're finding this narrative compelling and value the depth we're going into, please take a moment to hit that like button. It's completely free for you, but it's a huge sign of support that tells YouTube you enjoy our content and helps us reach more history enthusiasts around the world. And if you want to join our growing community, make sure to subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon to turn on notifications. Your support truly fuels our passion for uncovering these incredible stories. In our last part, we saw how China was growing weak like an old tree, and how Japan was quickly becoming strong like a young, sharp sword. They both watched Korea, a small land caught right in the middle. Now, the time for talking was over. A tiny spark would soon set off a huge fire. The spark came from within Korea itself. In 1894, a group of farmers and common people, called the Tonghak peasants, started a rebellion. They were unhappy with their government and with foreign influence. The Korean government was scared. They had no choice but to ask their old protector, China, for help. China, following its old ways, sent troops to help the Korean government. But Japan, who was watching very closely, saw this as its chance. They had been planning this for a long time. Japan sent an even larger number of its own well-trained soldiers to Korea, even though they weren't asked to by the Korean government. This was a very bold and aggressive move. Suddenly, both Chinese and Japanese soldiers were in Korea. The situation became very dangerous. People tried to talk to find a peaceful way out, but no one would back down. China insisted Japan leave, seeing it as interfering in its traditional relationship with Korea. Japan, however, refused to leave, seeing its chance to finally gain control. All talks failed. The path to war was now wide open. The first real shots were fired at sea. Japan, without a formal declaration of war, attacked Chinese warships and transport ships carrying soldiers. One very important incident was the sinking of the British ship, the Kaohsiung. This ship was carrying Chinese troops. Japan sunk it and many Chinese soldiers died. This was a clear sign that the fight had begun, and it was going to be brutal. Now let's look at the two armies that were about to clash. On one side, China had huge numbers of soldiers. On paper, their navy, the Beiyang fleet, looked impressive with many ships. But underneath, there were many problems. Their equipment was old. Their training was poor. Different commanders didn't work well together, and sadly, a lot of money meant for the army was stolen by corrupt officials. It was like a giant but rusty machine. On the other side, Japan's army was smaller in number, but their soldiers were very well organized. They had the newest weapons like modern rifles, powerful artillery cannons, and fast torpedo boats. They had learned from the best Western armies. Their soldiers had high spirits and believed in their mission. Most importantly, their whole army and navy worked together under one clear plan. This wasn't just a war between countries. It was a war between an old way of fighting and a new, modern way. On land, Japan's forces moved incredibly fast. They quickly invaded Korea and scored early victories. The Battle of Pyongyang, a key city in Korea, was a huge win for Japan. The Chinese forces defending it were quickly defeated. The world watched in disbelief at Japan's speed. But Japan didn't stop there. They pushed even further, right into China's own land, into a region called Manchuria. The speed of Japan's attacks had a huge effect on everyone. Chinese soldiers lost hope, and people around the world were shocked. No one expected Japan to be this powerful, this fast. The greatest battle of this war happened at sea, on the Yalu River. China's Beiyang fleet, as we mentioned, looked very strong on paper. It had large, impressive warships, but it was like a beautiful shell with little strength inside. Many of its cannons had no shells, and its crews were not well trained. In September 1894, the two mighty fleets met at the Battle of the Yalu River. It was a fierce and chaotic fight. The Japanese fleet, smaller but much faster, used clever tactics. They moved quickly, focusing their fire on one Chinese ship at a time, making it impossible for the Chinese to fight back effectively. The defeat of the Chinese fleet was crushing. Many Chinese ships were sunk or heavily damaged. This battle completely changed the war. Japan now controlled the seas, which meant they could land their soldiers anywhere in China. The old idea that China had strong naval power was completely shattered. It was a disaster for China. With the seas under their control, Japan launched direct attacks on China's most important strongholds. Port Arthur, a heavily protected naval base and fortress, was a key target. It was thought to be unbreakable, but the Japanese attacked it by both land and sea. The fighting was fierce, a brutal struggle for every inch of ground. Despite strong resistance, Port Arthur eventually fell to the Japanese. This was a huge blow to China's ability to defend itself. What happened next cast a dark shadow over Japan's victory. After the city fell, Japanese troops carried out a terrible massacre of Chinese soldiers and civilians. It was a horrifying event, a grim foreshadowing of even darker times to come. Soon after, another key Chinese naval base, Weihaiwei, was also captured. China's defenses were crumbling. It was clear that China had lost the war badly. With no way to fight on, China was forced to make peace. The negotiations for peace were held in a city called Shimonoseki. China was utterly defeated, and Japan was the clear winner. The world watched as China was forced to sign a very humiliating treaty. The Treaty of Shimonoseki was brutal for China. First, Korea was declared independent, but in truth, it was now completely under Japan's control. Second, China had to give the island of Taiwan to Japan. This led to fierce resistance from the Taiwanese people, who did not want to be ruled by Japan. Third, Japan took a piece of China's own land, the Liaodong Peninsula, which was part of Manchuria. Fourth, China had to pay a huge amount of money to Japan as a war payment. This money crippled China's finances for many years. And finally, new ports were opened for Japanese trade, and Japanese companies were given the right to build factories right inside China. This was a direct invasion of China's economy. For China, this treaty was a profound national humiliation, a complete loss of face on the world stage. It led to strong movements for reform, as people realized China had to change to survive. But it also fed a deep anti-foreign hatred, setting the stage for future unrest. For Japan, the victory brought a burst of national pride. It proved that their fast modernization had worked. It was a huge triumph. But it also gave them a dangerous sense of being unbeatable, a feeling that they could achieve anything through military power. But Japan's triumph was short-lived. Just days after the treaty was signed, three powerful European countries, Russia, Germany, and France, stepped in. This was called the Triple Intervention. They told Japan to give the Liaodong Peninsula back to China. Their motives were clear. They had their own plans for China and didn't want Japan to become too strong in the region. Japan was forced to give back Liaodong. The outrage and anger in Japan were immense. They felt deeply betrayed. They had won the war, only to have their victory snatched away by Western powers. This taught Japan a harsh lesson. Military power alone wasn't enough. To truly secure its gains, it needed global influence and strong alliances. This bitter experience fueled a deeper, more dangerous path for Japan. They understood that if they wanted to be a true world power and keep their gains, they would need an even stronger military and the ability to challenge the very powers that had interfered. The seeds of future conflicts were sown. After Japan's shocking victory in the First Sino-Japanese War and the humiliation of the Triple Intervention, Japan learned a powerful lesson. They realized that military strength alone wasn't enough to secure their place in the world. They needed more power, more influence, and strong friends. So, Japan began to invest a huge amount of money and effort into its army and navy. They started massive shipbuilding programs, creating powerful new warships. This was a clear message to the world. Japan was serious about becoming a major player on the global stage. A very important step came in 1902 when Japan made a special agreement and alliance with Great Britain. Britain was the world's most powerful country at the time. This alliance was crucial for Japan. It gave them international standing and helped them stand against Russia, who was also looking to expand in Asia. Japan was now a recognized great power, determined never to be humiliated again. These ambitions soon led to another massive conflict, the Russo-Japanese War, from 1904 to 1905. The cause was simple. Both Russia, a huge European empire, and Japan, a rising Asian power, wanted control over Manchuria and Korea. Their imperial desires clashed, and war became unavoidable. The war began with a long and bloody siege of Port Arthur, the very same fortified naval base Japan had captured from China. This time, it was a brutal ground fight against the Russians, lasting many months and costing many lives. The Japanese forces fought with incredible determination. On land, the Battle of Mukden was one of the largest land battles in history before World War I. Millions of soldiers fought in a massive, sprawling conflict that stretched for miles. Japan again proved its superior tactics and modern military organization against the larger Russian army. But the most decisive moment came at sea, the Battle of Tsushima. The entire Russian Baltic fleet, which had sailed all the way around the world, met the Japanese fleet. In a stunning display of naval power, Japan completely wiped out the Russian fleet. It was a victory so complete, it changed the course of naval history. This war sent shockwaves across the globe. For the first time in modern history, an Asian power had completely defeated a major European power. It shattered old ideas of European dominance and inspired nationalist movements across Asia. The world's balance of power had shifted dramatically. As a result of this victory, Japan gained full control over Korea and greatly increased its influence in Manchuria. It was a monumental step in Japan's rise as an imperial power. With its newfound power, Japan moved quickly to fully annex Korea. This was a gradual process, starting with growing control, then a protectorate status, and finally, in 1910, full annexation. Korea ceased to be an independent nation, becoming a colony of Japan. Japanese colonial rule in Korea was harsh. They tried to erase Korean culture, forcing Koreans to speak Japanese and adopt Japanese names. They exploited Korea's rich resources for their own benefit. It was a period of great suffering for the Korean people. But the Korean spirit was not broken. Even under harsh rule, early movements for independence began to rise, quietly at first, then growing louder. These were the seeds of future Korean nationalism. When World War I began in 1914, Japan saw another golden opportunity. They joined the Allies mostly to seize German colonial territories in China, like the important port city of Qingdao. This expanded Japan's foothold on the Asian mainland. Then, in 1915, Japan made a bold and shocking move. They secretly presented China with the 21 demands. These were a set of highly aggressive demands that would have turned China into a Japanese protectorate. They sought control over China's railways, mines, and even demanded Japanese advisors in the Chinese government. It was an attempt to take over China without firing a single shot. China was forced to accept many of these demands under great pressure, but the secret demands were leaked to the world, causing outrage. For the Chinese people, this was another deep humiliation, a painful reminder of their weakness. It sparked a huge explosion of Chinese nationalism, as people cried out for their country to be strong and truly independent. This wave of anger led to the May 4th movement in 1919. These were widespread protests, mostly led by students, against foreign powers and their own weak government. It was a pivotal moment, shaping the course of modern Chinese nationalism and setting the stage for future political changes. After World War I, there was a brief period when the world tried to work together to create a more stable and peaceful order. International efforts, like the Washington Naval Treaty in 1922, aimed to limit the size of navies and respect China's sovereignty. It seemed like a time of cooperation, a temporary calm in the brewing storm. But beneath this calm, China was in deep trouble. The ancient Qing dynasty had fallen in 1911, ending thousands of years of imperial rule. But this didn't bring peace. Instead, it plunged China into political chaos. From 1916 to 1928, China suffered through the warlord era. Powerful regional military leaders fought constantly for control, tearing the country apart. This brought immense suffering to ordinary people, who faced endless conflict and instability. Out of this chaos, two main political parties rose to prominence. The Nationalist Party, or KMT, led by figures like Sun Yat-sen and later Chiang Kai-shek, and the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, led by Mao Zedong. These two groups would shape China's future. In 1926, Chiang Kai-shek, now leader of the KMT, launched the Northern Expedition. This was a military campaign aimed at unifying China by defeating the various warlords. He achieved considerable success, bringing much of China under the KMT's theoretical control. However, this fragile unity didn't last. In 1927, the KMT and CCP, who had previously worked together, violently split. This marked the beginning of the long and brutal Chinese Civil War, adding another layer of deep division to an already struggling nation. So, while China appeared unified on paper under the KMT, it remained deeply fractured, plagued by internal strife and vulnerable to outside pressures. This was a dangerous weakness that Japan would soon exploit. Meanwhile, in Japan, a darker force was gaining strength: militarism. The Great Depression hit Japan hard, creating economic pressures and a desperate need for resources. Many in Japan believed that expansion abroad was the only way to save their country. Ultranationalism, an extreme form of national pride, grew very strong within the military and society. These extreme ideas pushed for aggressive expansion and control over Asia. They believed Japan was destined to lead the region by force if necessary. A particularly powerful and often rogue group was the Guandong Army, Japan's army stationed in Manchuria. They frequently acted on their own, making decisions without consulting the government in Tokyo. They were a law unto themselves, itching for a fight. This period was also marked by political assassinations. Liberal politicians who pushed for peace and less military spending were killed by extremist military factions. This showed how much power the military had gained over the government. The military's control over Japan's foreign policy grew stronger and stronger, pushing Japan towards aggressive expansion and total war. The peaceful lull was over. A storm was truly brewing. The curtain rose on the next major act of aggression in September 1931, the Manchurian Incident. The Japanese Guandong Army staged a small, fake explosion on a railway line near Mukden, which they owned. Even though the damage was tiny, the Guandong Army immediately blamed Chinese soldiers. Using this as an excuse, they launched a lightning-fast invasion, swiftly occupying all of Manchuria. It was a pre-planned act of aggression, carried out with ruthless efficiency. Japan then created a puppet state called Manchukuo, putting Puyi, the last emperor of China's Qing dynasty, on the throne as its emperor. This was propaganda to make it look like an independent country, but in reality it was completely controlled by Japan. The international community, represented by the League of Nations, investigated. The Lytton Commission was sent to study the situation. Its findings were clear. Japan was guilty of aggression. They had invaded a sovereign nation without cause. But Japan simply ignored the League's findings. In 1933, in an act of defiance, Japan walked out of the League of Nations, showing the world that it would not be stopped by international law or condemnations. The consequences of the Manchurian Incident were huge. It sent a clear signal that international law and organizations wouldn't stop Japan from its aggressive plans. This greatly encouraged Japanese militarists, showing them they could act without real consequences. It set the stage for the next, much larger invasion. Following Manchuria, Japan began to escalate its presence and influence in North China. There were numerous smaller skirmishes and diplomatic pressures, often created by Japan, to push their influence southward. They even created more puppet governments, like the East Hebei Autonomous Council, further chipping away at China's control and creating areas where Japanese power was supreme. Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of China, faced a terrible dilemma. He was fighting a brutal civil war against Mao Zedong's communists. His policy was to deal with the internal threat first, meaning the communists, before fully confronting the Japanese external threat. But the Chinese people's anger against Japan was growing stronger and stronger. They demanded that Chiang resist Japan with all his might, even if it meant stopping the fight against the communists. The pressure on Chiang was immense. The atmosphere was thick with suspense. It was clear that a full-scale war was not just possible but inevitable. Both China and Japan were bracing for the final, devastating clash that would soon erupt. Now the stage was set for a much larger, more terrible conflict. The year is 1937, and the world is about to witness the true horror of a full-scale war. The spark that finally set off this huge war happened in July 1937, at a place called the Marco Polo Bridge, just outside Beijing. Japanese soldiers were doing military exercises very close to the bridge, which was in Chinese territory. This was already a very tense situation. One night, there was an exchange of fire, shots were fired, but it's still unclear who shot first. Then, a Japanese soldier went missing. The Japanese military immediately demanded to search a nearby Chinese town for him. The Chinese refused. This small incident quickly blew up. Local leaders on both sides tried to calm things down, to find a peaceful solution. But their efforts failed. The Japanese military, especially the Guangdong Army, saw this as an opportunity. They quickly sent more troops, and the fighting spread rapidly beyond the bridge, becoming a full-blown conflict across North China. Japan's leaders in Tokyo made a fateful decision: to launch a full-scale invasion of China. They believed it would be a quick victory. But China, under Chiang Kai-shek, also made a brave decision. They resolved to resist with all their might, even if it meant a long and painful war. The Second Sino-Japanese War had officially begun. The first major battle was the Battle of Shanghai, starting in August 1937. Shanghai was a huge, important city. It was China's biggest port, its economic heart, and a symbol of its connection to the rest of the world. It was also home to many foreign communities. Chiang Kai-shek made a daring and very costly decision. Instead of letting the Japanese take Shanghai easily, he committed his best, German-trained troops to defend the city. He knew it would be a bloody fight, but he wanted to show the world China's determination to resist and to draw international attention to Japan's aggression. What followed was 3 months of brutal urban warfare. It was fighting house to house, street by street, building by building. Every corner, every alley became a battlefield. The fighting was incredibly fierce, turning the modern city into a pile of rubble. The human cost was immense. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers and civilians died. The destruction was unimaginable. Shanghai, once a shining city, became a symbol of the war's terrible cruelty and the immense sacrifice of the Chinese people. As the Chinese forces slowly retreated from Shanghai, they used a scorched earth tactic. They destroyed their own factories, bridges, and infrastructure. They did this to prevent the Japanese from using them, hoping to slow down the Japanese advance and deny them valuable resources. Foreign observers in Shanghai, many living in the international settlements, watched in horror. They were shocked by the sheer scale of the destruction and the brutality of the fighting. The battle brought Japan's aggression into sharp focus for the world. After Shanghai, the Japanese army marched towards Nanjing, China's capital city. The Chinese government had already begun to move inland, knowing the capital would fall. The city was captured in December 1937. What happened next in Nanjing is one of the darkest chapters in human history, known as the Nanjing Massacre. For 6 weeks, from December 1937 into January 1938, the Japanese Imperial Army unleashed unimaginable atrocities upon the city's civilians and disarmed soldiers. The killings were systematic and widespread. Mass executions of disarmed Chinese soldiers and civilians took place. People were rounded up and murdered in cold blood. The sheer number of victims is staggering, estimated to be in the hundreds of thousands. Beyond the killings, there was widespread rape. Tens of thousands of women, from young girls to the elderly, were subjected to horrific sexual violence. The city was also looted and burned, with countless homes and buildings destroyed. Crucially, there were foreign civilians in Nanjing who witnessed these horrors. People like John Rabe, a German businessman, and Minnie Vautrin, an American missionary, helped establish the Nanjing Safety Zone. They risked their lives to protect thousands of Chinese civilians and meticulously documented the atrocities they saw. The Nanjing Massacre has left a profound and lasting scar on Chinese memory. It remains a deeply painful event that continues to affect Sino-Japanese relations to this day, with ongoing historical debates surrounding its scale and nature. It stands as a stark reminder of the depths of wartime depravity and the targeting of innocent civilians. Despite these horrors, China did not break. The nationalist government, led by Chiang Kai-shek, adopted a new strategy. They decided to retreat deep into China's vast interior, moving the capital to Chongqing. This was called trading space for time. The idea was to drag the Japanese army deeper and deeper into China, stretching their supply lines and making it harder for them to control the vast territory. While there were some limited conventional battles like the Battle of Wuhan and the Battle of Changsha, the main goal was to exhaust the Japanese. However, the nationalist government faced immense difficulties. They struggled with internal divisions, corruption, and constant pressure from the Japanese. Later, they also faced pressure from their allies like the United States to engage the Japanese more directly. Meanwhile, the Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong, adopted a very different strategy: guerrilla warfare. They avoided large, direct battles and instead focused on smaller, surprise attacks, ambushes, and sabotage against the Japanese. They established base areas in the countryside, living among the peasants and expanding their influence by helping the rural population. This strategy allowed them to survive and even grow stronger during the war. One notable communist offensive was the 100 Regiments Offensive in 1940, a large-scale attack on Japanese communication lines and strongholds. It showed the communists' growing strength and their ability to launch significant operations. Despite their deep hatred for each other, the KMT and CCP formed an uneasy alliance, a united front against their common enemy, Japan. This alliance had moments of success, but it was often fragile and broke down frequently, as both sides continued to mistrust each other. Beyond the battlefields, the Japanese occupation was marked by unimaginable atrocities. The three alls policy, kill all, burn all, loot all, was brutally implemented in many occupied areas, especially in the countryside. This policy was designed to crush Chinese resistance and terrorize the population. Even more horrific was Unit 731, a secret Japanese biological and chemical warfare research unit in Manchuria. Here, horrific experiments were conducted on living human beings, Chinese civilians, Korean patriots, and Russian prisoners of war. They were subjected to unimaginable torture and deadly diseases, all in the name of developing biological weapons. After the war, many involved in Unit 731 were never held accountable for their crimes, gaining immunity in exchange for their research data. This remains a deeply painful and controversial issue. Another terrible aspect was the comfort women system. Hundreds of thousands of women, primarily from China, Korea, and the Philippines, were forced into sexual slavery to serve Japanese soldiers. This was a systematic crime against humanity, and the survivors continue to demand official apologies and compensation to this day. Beyond these, countless Chinese civilians were forced into labor, working for the Japanese war effort in mines, factories, and construction projects. Japan also systematically exploited China's rich natural resources, stripping the land for its own war machine. To control the vast occupied areas, Japan set up numerous puppet governments, like Wang Jingwei's reorganized national government. These governments were supposedly Chinese, but they were entirely controlled by Japan, serving Japanese interests. Fighting such a vast war presented huge challenges for both sides. For Japan, their supply lines became incredibly overstretched. They had to maintain control over enormous occupied territories, and they were fighting two different Chinese forces, the KMT and the CCP, who used different tactics. For China, the challenges were equally immense. They lacked modern industry, making it hard to produce weapons and supplies. They relied heavily on foreign aid, and their internal divisions and forced conscription of soldiers added to their difficulties. China's vast and difficult terrain, its towering mountains, wide rivers, and endless plains, also played a crucial role. It greatly hindered the Japanese advance, making it impossible for them to achieve a quick, decisive victory and forcing them into a long, drawn-out war. The Second Sino-Japanese War, initially a regional conflict, gradually became part of a much larger global war. Before Pearl Harbor, the United States provided some support to China, notably through the Flying Tigers, an American volunteer group of pilots who fought against Japanese air forces. The U.S. also provided limited financial aid and moral support to China. However, Japan's continued expansion south, into Indochina, greatly increased tensions with the United States, who saw their own interests threatened. Then came the pivotal moment, Pearl Harbor, on December 7, 1941. Japan's surprise attack on the U.S. naval base brought the United States formally into World War II. This event officially merged the Second Sino-Japanese War into the larger Pacific theater of World War II. China was now formally recognized as an Allied power. It began receiving more substantial Lend-Lease aid from the U.S. and its allies. Crucially, China's continued resistance tied down millions of Japanese soldiers, preventing them from being used elsewhere in the Pacific, which was a huge help to the Allied war effort. The Burma Road remained a vital lifeline, a treacherous mountain route that continued to supply China with much-needed aid from the Allies, despite constant Japanese attempts to cut it off. Towards the very end of the war, in August 1945, the Soviet Union also entered the war against Japan, launching a massive invasion of Japanese-occupied Manchuria. This was a final, devastating blow to Japan's forces on the mainland. The end of the nightmare finally came in 1945. The Allies intensified their pressure, with the U.S. launching relentless bombing campaigns against Japan and pushing closer with their island-hopping strategy in the Pacific. Then came the two devastating atomic bombs, Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th. These unprecedented weapons caused unimaginable destruction and loss of life, forcing Japan to confront total defeat. With the atomic bombs and the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, Japan had no choice. On September 2nd, 1945, Japan formally surrendered. This marked the official end of World War II and, with it, the brutal Second Sino-Japanese War. For China, it was a moment of immense joy and relief. The long nightmare was finally over. But this joy was mixed with unimaginable devastation. Millions had died, cities were in ruins, and the country was exhausted. The war had ended, but its scars would last for generations. The Second Sino-Japanese War finally ended in 1945, bringing an end to years of unimaginable suffering for China. But for China, peace did not last long. The defeat of Japan, while a victory, created a huge power vacuum. Almost immediately, the bitter Chinese Civil War between Chiang Kai-shek's Nationalist Party, KMT, and Mao Zedong's Communist Party, CCP, began again. It had been paused to fight the Japanese, but now their old hatreds flared up. The United States provided aid to the nationalist government, hoping to prevent a communist takeover. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, secretly supported the Chinese communists, supplying them with captured Japanese weapons from Manchuria. China became a proxy battlefield in the emerging Cold War. After 4 more years of brutal fighting, the communists, led by Mao Zedong, achieved victory. On October 1st, 1949, Mao declared the establishment of the People's Republic of China in Beijing. Chiang Kai-shek and the remaining nationalist forces fled to the island of Taiwan. The war with Japan, though fought against a common enemy, had deeply reshaped China's political landscape, leading directly to the creation of two Chinas, the communist mainland and nationalist Taiwan. This division continues to be a central issue in global politics today. While China endured civil war, Japan underwent a remarkable transformation. After its surrender, Japan was placed under Allied occupation, primarily led by the United States under General Douglas MacArthur from 1945 to 1952. The goal of the occupation was to reform Japan and ensure it would never again be a military threat. Japan was demilitarized. Its army and navy were dismantled. Sweeping democratic reforms were introduced, giving more power to the people and establishing a new constitution. One of the most important reforms was the pacifist constitution, specifically Article 9. This article famously states that the Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation. It meant Japan would maintain only self-defense forces and would not wage war. After the occupation ended, Japan achieved an economic miracle. With American support and its own industrious spirit, Japan rapidly rebuilt its devastated industries. It transformed from a military power into a global economic powerhouse, producing cars, electronics, and technology that swept the world. This transformation was remarkable. Japan went from an aggressive empire to a peaceful, democratic nation focused on trade and technology. Its reinvention is one of the most striking outcomes of World War II. Despite Japan's transformation, the ghosts of the past continue to haunt its relationship with China and other Asian nations. The way the war is remembered or forgotten causes deep disagreements. In China, there is a strong, unified national story of the war. It emphasizes Chinese victimhood, heroic resistance, and the immense suffering caused by Japanese atrocities, especially the Nanjing Massacre. Memorials like the one in Nanjing are powerful reminders, and anti-Japanese protests still occur. In Japan, views are more diverse. While many Japanese acknowledge the atrocities, others downplay or even deny them. This is often reflected in Japanese history textbooks, which can sometimes gloss over or omit painful wartime events, causing outrage in China and Korea. A major point of tension is the Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo. This shrine honors Japan's war dead, including convicted Class A war criminals from World War II. When Japanese politicians visit Yasukuni, it is seen by China and Korea as an insult to the victims and a sign that Japan has not truly repented for its wartime actions. Japan has issued various official apologies for its wartime actions over the decades. However, these apologies are often seen by China and Korea as insufficient or insincere, particularly when accompanied by actions like Yasukuni visits or problematic textbook narratives. The comfort women issue remains a particularly sensitive and painful wound. Survivors and activists continue to demand official apologies, direct compensation, and proper historical education about the forced sexual slavery of hundreds of thousands of women during the war. Despite these deep historical grievances, modern Sino-Japanese relations are also marked by strong economic ties. China and Japan are huge trading partners, with massive amounts of goods and investments flowing between them. Their economies are deeply interdependent. However, this economic cooperation often coexists with lingering distrust. Historical issues can suddenly flare up, leading to diplomatic disputes and protests, showing how fragile the relationship can be beneath the surface of trade. Beyond history, territorial disputes, particularly over the uninhabited Senkaku/Diaoyu Islands in the East China Sea, add another layer of tension. Both countries claim these islands, and naval and coast guard vessels frequently confront each other there. Finally, there's the growing geopolitical rivalry in East Asia. As China rises as a global superpower, and Japan remains a key U.S. ally, their power dynamics create a complex and often competitive relationship that extends beyond historical grievances. The wars between China and Japan offer profound lessons for humanity. The first is the staggering cost of war. Millions of lives were lost, entire cities were destroyed, and the psychological scars of these conflicts run deep, affecting generations. Second, the dangers of unchecked nationalism and militarism are clear. When extreme national pride and military aggression take over, They can lead to unimaginable brutality, racism, and widespread human rights abuses. Third, these conflicts highlight the importance of historical truth. For true reconciliation to happen, both sides must openly and honestly confront the painful past, acknowledge suffering, and seek understanding, even when it is difficult. The wars between China and Japan fundamentally shaped the modern world. They influenced the dynamics of the Cold War, directly led to the rise of modern China, and transformed Japan into the nation it is today. Their impact echoes in global politics, trade, and even cultural exchange. The complex relationship between China and Japan continues to evolve. Will economic cooperation overcome historical grievances? Will their geopolitical rivalry lead to new tensions, or can they find a path towards genuine mutual understanding and a shared future? The lessons of the dragon's fury are clear. History, whether acknowledged or ignored, always casts a long shadow. Understanding it is the first step towards building a more peaceful and just future.